Hello there, friends and enemies, and welcome back to the Silent Hill series review. Today we're going to be talking about the second era of Silent Hill, the 4 games made after Team Silent at Konami was disbanded. Much like last time, I apologize if some of the things I say in this video sound a little bit wrong, if I get something mistaken, or even if some things sound a little bit weird. I am working this without a script. But I promise not to make the same mistake that I did with Eileen from Silent Hill 4. Also, much like last time, there are going to be spoilers in this video, so check the timestamps down below if you want parts that are non-spoiler, although you probably aren't going to get a lot of information in those parts. Silent Hill Origins starts off second era with a prequel. The game follows trucker Travis Grady as he accidentally returns to his hometown of Silent Hill while on a delivery. There he comes across a house burning down, which ultimately leads him into waking up in the hospital in the town of Silent Hill. As a game, Origins is fun enough. Narratively, it follows in the footsteps of Silent Hill 1, having somewhat of a lackluster story, although having a little bit more to pull it together than Silent Hill 1 did. While this game brings us back in touch with the cult and what they were doing before the events of Silent Hill 1, we also get to go through the story of childhood trauma in the way of Travis Grady's story. Origins is the one game out of the entirety of Second Era that feels like an old original Silent Hill game. It feels like it fits in really well with the first 4 games. Mechanically speaking, we stick with the fixed camera angle that the first 4 games had, but we also improve a little bit more on combat. Travis's combat feels a little more fluid and a little more fun to play out. Firearm combat, of course, is as always as feel-good as it can be, maybe even a little bit better than the first 4 Silent Hill games, at least the first 3. But unlike the first 3 Silent Hill games, Origins pushes melee combat pretty hard, actually. Melee weapons are so hard to find, in fact, that it seems almost purposeful that they left out ammo from most of the game, so you're required to use your melee weapons at a point in time. The opposite side to this is that melee weapons are breakable in Origins, which is a game trope that I don't really personally find all that well integrated into most games. I feel like Origins handles it fine. You know, they give you an abundance, an overabundance actually, of melee weapons, so it kind of balances out the whole breakable weapon thing, but it still feels a little bad at times. Though along with this, they added in a mechanic new to Silent Hill, that being throwable weapon, which does not come into play in any other Silent Hill game. Throwable weapons were a good balance for breakable weapons because most of the time they dealt a ton of damage in the one hit they would get out of being thrown. Generally speaking, this made combat feel quite a bit better than you would actually expect it to be. The combat kind of fails, in my opinion, when enemies are involved. Enemy AI is pretty standard in Origins comparatively to other Silent Hill games, not to mention that their monster design, while not being anything special, is pretty effective, much like Silent Hill 1. But they've made the grappling system in Origins a little more pronounced than it feels like it is in other Silent Hill games so far. Enemies grapple you not only easily, but also frequently, and grappling is a quick-time event to escape from, which on one hand feels good given that we haven't had that type of interaction with grappling before, but on the other hand can feel a little bad because the game sometimes doesn't exactly work when you put in the QuickTime event inputs. You're meant to mash a singular button when you're grappled, but sometimes the game won't even register that you're mashing that button. These unresponsive controls don't come up a whole bunch in Origins, at least not to my recollection, but they can make the game be a little bit more frustrating to play if you're going through an area with a ton of enemies. And let me tell you, Origins really doesn't like to pull their punches when it comes to giving you areas full of enemies. Though, as I said before, mechanically speaking, the game feels really nice. It just feels like you're playing the Silent Hill games you're used to playing. it might feel a little stale at this point, especially if you've been playing them in sequence. But for the most part, I think the atmosphere as well as the tone that Origins keeps the same energy that the first 4 Silent Hill games have given us thus far. I only really have to dock it points for being narratively a little bit lackluster, and for at times feeling just a little bit overly empty. I said before that there are plenty of areas that have an overabundance of enemies, and on the opposite side of that coin is that there are kind of a lot of areas where there aren't that many enemies, or sometimes no enemies at all. Generally speaking, these empty areas are left up to puzzles, but puzzles in Origins do not really feel as though they give you too much of a challenge. Silent Hill Origins was one of the games in the Silent Hill series that I played non-stop when I was a teenager because I had open access to it, and puzzles back then felt really easy in the game, and playing it again as an adult, I can see that puzzles in Origins are simply just easy. Whereas the real challenge in the game comes with traversing maps, given that maps are often incredibly large and full of a lot of rooms. Although it is worth saying that this is the first and only Silent Hill games where switching between the real world and the other world is something that you do manually as the player. And this, I feel, makes it a really good decision, but also adds on to the maps that you're playing through. You're now having to solve puzzles by jumping into the other world, grabbing something, and then jumping back into the real world in order to find out where that thing goes. Which I think is a really good idea for a Silent Hill game, but I feel like Origins can feel a little bit overzealous with the way that it uses it. Overall, I enjoy Origins, and I think it is a fun game to play. I believe that if you're playing through the Silent Hill series, as long as you like at least the first game, Origins is definitely a game for you to enjoy. Mediocre Gaming gives Silent Hill Origins a 6 out of 10. Silent Hill Homecoming wakes us up as Alex Shepard, military man who's returning to his home Shepherd's Glen, which is a neighboring town of Silent Hill. Much like Origins, Homecoming is a game that I played constantly when I was a teenager. I played it over and over and over again, and I loved it, and it was one of the few Silent Hill games that I actually had open access to as a teenager. For a long time, it stood as my favorite Silent Hill game, and replaying it as an adult now, about 15 years later, it, kind of kept up. Narratively speaking, Homecoming takes a lot of inspiration from the 2006 Silent Hill movie, which is why you can feel a lot of those horror tropes coming through in the game. Alex is returning home to Shepherd's Glen after fulfilling some military duty to find that his brother Joshua has gone missing, and he is in search of finding him, all the while finding out that Shepherd's Glen has actually been used by the Order to cultivate human sacrifices in the forms of the townspeople's children. The story of Homecoming, in my opinion at least, kind of breaks where the story of Silent Hill 3 ends the Silent Hill Order story, but I could be wrong about this. That's just how I feel in the way that the games interact with each other. For the most part, the characters in Homecoming feel very flat and one note, and all those tropes that I mentioned before end up making every single storyline that you come across pretty predictable when it comes around to figuring out what's going on in the town. Other characters just seem crazy powerful in the world of Silent Hill, or even in the real world. They just kind of take a lot to the face and have no consequences for it. Though personally speaking, I do think that the tropiness of Homecoming kind of adds to the charm of the game quite a bit. There's something else I want to say about the story, but we'll get back to it in just a second. I do want to touch on gameplay. Gameplay in Homecoming is kind of a mixed bag. For one, I feel like the combat in Homecoming is some of the best combat in the Silent Hill series. Combat feels really nice, especially with the added dodge mechanic that you have in the game. It really just kind of pulls combat together and makes it feel like you're actually fighting creatures rather than just hitting them with what you got and then getting hit back, which I guess is to be expected from Mr. Military Man Alex. I also feel like the monster design in Homecoming is some of the most fun, most creative monster design in the Silent Hill franchise. Most of these monsters don't necessarily have much meaning to their design in relation to Alex Shepard himself, but the design philosophy that Homecoming uses is pretty fun, considering that it's just taking from, once again, those movie tropes of just having something scary happen to you. I feel like this is also showcased in some of the set pieces. Certain areas of Silent Hill Homecoming look really, really nice. I really like the industrial feel of the Otherworld, but it also definitely really calls back to the Silent Hill movie in a way that's kind of hard to ignore. And because this game wants to follow movie tropes so badly, it gets one of the biggest downfalls that it can have as a horror game and as a Silent Hill game. Homecoming is so dark. Genuinely, there are certain areas in Homecoming that are really hard to see because it is close to pitch black. I had this game on the highest brightness setting that I could when I was playing it earlier this year, and it was still incredibly hard to see certain things in certain areas. Other than that, Homecoming starts up a certain mechanic that we're going to see in one way or another ending out the series as it is currently, and it's not really good in my opinion. Decision making in Homecoming feels really bad, and it feels really disruptive to the game. These decision-making moments start with an in-game cutscene until they progress into a still camera shot of Alex's face with two large options on the side of his face as to what you'd like to do next. This really breaks the great game design that Silent Hill has had so far to give you a, here's a decision, wouldn't you like to make it? And of course, these decisions are meant to affect the endings, which I will talk about in just a second, but the decision making in Homecoming, as I stated a little bit earlier, feels disruptive to the game. It takes up too much time, and it just kind of feels like it slows you down a little bit, which I feel like is bad in a game that's supposed to be survival horror, where you're supposed to be thinking about what you're doing next as it's happening. Taking the player out of the game just to have them make a specific decision in a game that's supposed to feel kind of adrenaline rushy can make them kind of not think about the consequences of what's going to happen after that decision. Homecoming does it fine, I guess, where it doesn't necessarily fully take you out of the game, but it still feels kind of not right. It doesn't feel good for a Silent Hill game to have two options that you're supposed to choose between blatantly up there on the screen. But that's just in my opinion. Getting back to the story, ultimately, Alex discovers that he was meant to be the sacrifice for the Order, and this ultimately ends up in him going to Silent Hill from Shepherd's Glen. When we get to Silent Hill, we do meet the worst designed enemies in the entire series, in my opinion, the cultists. They're kind of just generally annoying to try and fight, and they are really badly made enemies, just in my opinion. But this leads to the ultimate revelation of the game, where you find out that Josh isn't missing, and Alex isn't a military man. Alex accidentally killed Josh during a fight that they had on a boat years ago, and repressed the memory and has since been put into a mental hospital. In this way, we kind of get a story about repressed memory and guilt, but the reason I wanted to bring this up now at the end is because I wanted to talk about the endings of Homecoming. I haven't really talked about Silent Hill endings in these two videos, but it should be a well-known fact that Silent Hill predicates itself on having multiple endings each game. Generally speaking, these endings are meant to symbolize what you did in-game and how it affects the characters that you're playing as in their lives after the game, or sometimes beforehand. Silent Hill Homecoming's endings are horrendous. The endings are disjointed, and none of the endings have anything to do with each other, and for the most part, none of the endings feel like they connect to the game in any meaningful way. A few of the endings actually make the game not matter at all, which means, why did I have to make any decisions in the game if the game didn't matter? Why make a plotline where both parents try to get Alex's forgiveness and then just end up having an ending where Alex's dad kills him anyway? Presumably, by the way, before Josh dies. Even if it was after Josh died, then that means he wasn't following the Order's whole deal at all. At least if I'm getting into the story correctly. You also have the Boogeyman ending, where two pyramid heads come up and turn Alex into a pyramid head, which is an entire deal on its own that I don't want to talk about. In fact, the ending of Homecoming that makes the most sense is the UFO ending. The ending that is historically a joke in every single Silent Hill game is the ending that makes the most sense in Silent Hill Homecoming. At the end of the day, it's very easy to tell that Silent Hill Homecoming came from a group of people that were fans of Silent Hill, but didn't really get a grasp on why the series is as good as it is. They ended up making a game that was fun, in my opinion, but they didn't make a good game, neither as a Silent Hill game or as a horror game. This game stands out to me because I find it really fun to play. When you beat the game, as with most Silent Hill games, you get some extra weapons and stuff as a New Game Plus option, and the new weapons in New Game Plus feel really good. But ultimately, returning to Homecoming as an adult, I found it to be not that great of a Silent Hill game. In fact, I would argue that it is one of the worst Silent Hill games. And it's all simply predicated off of the fact that it's only following horror tropes and not actually doing anything with its namesake. It's a Silent Hill for the sake of being a Silent Hill. That being said, I do still enjoy Homecoming as a game. And Mediocre Gaming is going to give Silent Hill Homecoming a 5 out of 10. Silent Hill Shattered Memories brings us a reimagining of Silent Hill 1. Throwing us back into the shoes of Harry Mason, we are seeing Silent Hill 1 through a different lens, going back and forth between actual parts in Silent Hill and therapy sessions with Dr. Kaufman. Much like the last two games, I played Shattered Memories constantly when I was a teenager, so coming back to it as an adult, it was nice to have a fresh pair of eyes to see this game with. Now, while being a reimagining of Silent Hill 1, it's very, very different and stands out very much from the rest of the Silent Hill series. One noticeable difference is that Shattered Memories is devoid of combat. There is no combat in this game whatsoever. Instead, the choice of opting into chase scenes was made. You all know my feelings about chase scenes, but we'll talk about them more once we talk about gameplay. This game also introduced therapy sessions, which is the placeholder for decision making in the game, which I've talked about with Homecoming. I don't like decisions being in your face and being told that they are decisions, but I think it works in Shattered Memories, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Narratively speaking, Shattered Memories is very, very different from Silent Hill 1. Whereas in Silent Hill 1, we got this story of a man looking for his lost daughter and discovering a cult of this town who his daughter is essentially born from. Shattered Memories gives us the story of a Harry Mason who not only lost his daughter and has to look for her, but is also dealing with a very hard life with the family of his wife and daughter. For one reason or another, decision you make throughout the game will determine how Harry acts towards his family and how that changes the dynamic between him and the rest of his family, mainly affecting his daughter. I enjoyed the new story beats. It was fun to see the way that Harry interacts with the characters in the game, especially noting that most of the other characters that Harry interacts with are women in the game, which leads to some really fun realizations depending on which ending that you get in Shattered Memories. In the end of the game, it is revealed that the therapy sessions were not Harry telling his story, but Heather telling the story of Harry looking for her. This is meant to talk about Heather having a broken family life with Dahlia as her mom and Harry as her father, but also her skewed perception of how Harry really was as a father compared to how he is in real life. Aside from that though, there are other little narrative bits that you can get in-game of other characters in the town that are, of course, not really there in the game, which I think is interesting and adds a little bit more character to the town of Silent Hill itself and gives it a little bit more life than previous games have given it. It's also really refreshing in this game to have Harry Mason and Heather actually live in the town rather than be coming to the town from somewhere else. A first for the Silent Hill series. Gameplay-wise, Shattered Memories is sadly nothing special. Most of the game is exploration, which normally I enjoy in video games, but in a series like Silent Hill, I'm expecting more of a survival horror rather than an exploration horror. Not to say that the explorations don't work, because there are plenty of times where exploring the world and seeing different things in the world works really, really well in Shattered Memories' favor. There are these things called echoes, which I really enjoy, which are essentially like ghost images of things that have happened in the world. Aside from exploration, it's very obvious that Shattered Memories was meant to be really puzzle-based. I really enjoy the way that puzzles are integrated into Shattered Memories, having you interact more with your environment and look at the tiny things around you to figure out the puzzle, rather than just having an obvious solution all the time immediately to you. This isn't always played out in the best way, and I wish that sometimes it were played out a little bit better, but there are a lot of times when puzzle solving is really, really fun in Shattered Memories. Therapy sessions in the game act as your hub for making decisions. Different answers you give to questions in therapy sessions will affect different ways that the game will play, and even different puzzles that you'll see in the game. This can go as far as affecting the way that characters look in-game, and even affecting the looks of the enemies in Shattered Memories. And while I do think this is a refreshing change for the Silent Hill series as a whole, I do kind of wish that this was integrated a little bit better. Affecting the characters' locations and puzzles is fine, but mainly speaking about enemies, there's only one enemy type in Shattered Memories, and the only thing that changes on them is their appearance. I feel like it would have been a little bit better integrated if at the time we had the ability to make the answers to the therapy sessions change what monsters you see entirely. You could maybe have an entire catalog of different monsters that come up based on different answers, and then have the game show those monsters in as the answers are given in-game. I just feel like if this was in addition to the game, as well as bringing back in combat, it would have made the game a little bit more interesting and fun to play. Sadly, what the game is right now, aside from finding little story pieces in the world, it kind of feels a little bit empty. For the most part, you're just running around and going to the next place. Of course, you can find mementos and echoes and voice recordings, but it feels like the world is kind of just living around you while you're finding these things, and there's not anything actually scary happening to you. I suppose I should say that is until the chase scenes. I have mixed feelings on the Shattered Memories chase scenes. For the most part, I'm not a fan of chase scenes in general, as I've said before. Shattered Memories is no different. I find the chase scenes to be kind of annoying and frustrating, especially since you can easily loop yourself back around. During chase scenes, you are able to pull out your phone and look at the map, which gives you an indication of where you've already been in the area that the chase has taken place, but it feels like this was kind of an afterthought put into the game, as pulling out your phone doesn't necessarily pause the game and still allows you to get attacked if creatures get close to you. However, I don't think chase scenes are all bad, and when you get into your first chase scene, I feel like it does a good job of giving you the type of fear. Everything becomes frozen around you, and it gives you a real sense of the world actually changing. I wouldn't necessarily call this change in Shattered Memories a change to the other world, but it does definitely feel a little bit different. Things feel a little more dangerous when you're in the other world in Shattered Memories. You are given the ability to hide if monsters are catching up to you a little bit too much, but sometimes this really just doesn't work. You kind of have to be on a specific level of not being seen by monsters if hiding is to work for you. That's not to say that it's never worked for me. I've gotten it to work a lot of times, but most of the time it felt like I would hide and then 20 seconds later one of the creatures would pull me out of my hiding place and I'd have to run again. Not to mention that if you get a bunch of creatures ganged up on you, they'll all grab onto you. You can shake them off, but if too many are on you at once, you will die pretty fast. The game is supposed to have a system in place so that if this happens to you, the chase scenes will get a little bit easier the next time you go through, but in my experience, it didn't feel that way, but maybe I'm just bad at chase scenes, which is probably also why I don't like them. Going back a little bit, like I said, Shattered Memories feels really empty, and one of the problems with this, narratively speaking, is the endings. The endings to Shattered Memories are incredible. I love each and every one of them. Every single ending in Shattered Memories tells a different story. You can get two different possible endings, one with Heather confronting the ghost of Harry, and one the actual ending of the game that shows you how Harry was treated or was treating his wife and daughter during their home life. Not only is it refreshing to get a combination of different endings based on different things that you do in the game, but it also is, like I said, gives you a refreshing look at what these characters' lives are. I adore all of the endings of Shattered Memories because it gives such depth to the story and it gives such depth to these characters, at least in the context of this confined game. And the problem that I find with this is that the endings are holding Shattered Memories up where everything else is failing it. I truly believe in my heart of hearts that Shattered Memories would not be an enjoyable game if it did not have the endings that it has. If Shattered Memories had endings that mimicked, say, Silent Hill 4 or even Homecoming, this game would not be nearly as good as it is to play. And maybe I sound like I'm hating on it a little too much, but I cannot get over the fact that when actually playing the game itself, there's not a lot to do. You just kind of go through the motions until you reach the ending. Not to say there aren't fun things in Shattered Memories, just to say that Shattered Memories as a whole doesn't really emanate all those things that you really want in a Silent Hill game. In conclusion, Shattered Memories is a really fun game, and I definitely recommend it to anyone that enjoys psychological horror that is kind of slow burn and has a kind of emotional toll to it. However, if you're looking to play a game that's like the other Silent Hill games that is in fact a survival psychological horror, Shattered Memories is not really the game for you. I feel like it's worth at least a play if you're just a fan of the series in general, but if you're a casual player who just likes horror games that will come out at you and scare you, this may not be the game for you. Mediocre Gaming gives Silent Hill Shattered Memories a 4 out of 10. Ending off the Silent Hill series as it is currently, we have Silent Hill Downpour, that puts us in the shoes of prisoner Murphy Pendleton. Originally, I played Silent Hill Downpour when it released, and it emanated in one of the scariest nights of gaming I've ever had for multiple different reasons. I remembered enjoying it, and then when I came back to it in 2016, I remember not liking it all that much, and coming back to it again in 2023, it was actually surprisingly a pretty good Silent Hill game. Murphy acts as our second protagonist that has no connections to Silent Hill and ends up there by chance during a prison transport. The beginning of the game starts off a little bit unconventionally for a Silent Hill game, showing us a middle part of Murphy's story where he's already doing something that causes us to wonder what is happening in his life. We see Murphy kill a man in a bathroom, we see him enter his transport to maximum security prison, and then we see his bus crash and he lands in Devil's Pit, eventually going into Silent Hill. Narratively speaking, the game has its ups and downs, and there are some questions that kind of feel like they don't get tied up in a satisfying way, but overall, Downpour has a pretty solid story. Story beats in Downpour, while not always satisfying, it don't ever feel like they're actually plot holes, though sometimes certain story beats and characters can be slightly confusing. Downpour mirrors Shattered Memories in the fact that it has a plethora of endings, but it also has dual endings. You can get 2 different endings, and each different ending can change based on what you do in the game. Although it is important to note that Downpour also has a ton of mirrors to Silent Hill 2, having Murphy be a very silent antagonist and also having him deal with grief. Things in the story are revealed at a similar pacing to the way that the story in Silent Hill 2 is revealed, and it just kind of feels really good to play this game and see everything play out. Gameplay-wise, Downpour has a mishmash of things. It keeps the over-the-shoulder camera from Shattered Memories and Homecoming, and it keeps the chase scenes from Shattered Memories as well. Although I feel personally like they're done a little bit better in Downpour. I would even say they're done much better in Downpour than they are in Shattered Memories. Combat in Downpour feels pretty good, and I adore the Otherworld in Downpour. I personally feel like it's the best Otherworld in the Silent Hill series. Downpour's otherworld is a reflection of the real world, and it feels very disorienting, and sometimes it feels like it's alive and toying with you. Which I feel like is what all of the Silent Hill games have been trying to capture, and I feel like Downpour captures it really, really well. Enemy design in Downpour isn't super great. All of the enemies are just kind of one type of enemy with a different skin slapped on them and different movesets. They do introduce the Executioner, another Pyramid Head knockoff. And while I don't believe he is as iconic as Pyramid Head is, I think he's pretty effective as a diet Pyramid Head. You encounter him only a few times, you encounter him throughout almost the entire game, and every time you encounter him that he is attacking you, he feels very powerful and he feels very different from the other enemies in the game. It's also worth noting that Murphy is the first character in the Silent Hill series that actually reacts to things in the way that a normal person would react to things. He gets scared and will yell a lot, even if it becomes an annoyance. And even if it does feel kind of annoying sometimes, it is kind of refreshing to have a character that actually reacts to things happening around them in what seems to be a visceral, primal, real way. The game introduces side quests which are pretty fun, and it does feel pretty open world. The town of Silent Hill itself is super beautiful and fun to run around in. This game is, of course though, not without its problems. Much like with Homecoming, this game gives you giant buttons on the screen whenever it wants you to make a decision. It gives you a essentially yes or no answer, and you have to choose which one you want to do, and that will ultimately have an outcome on the ending of the game. The game also mimics some of the darkness that Homecoming has. It's not as dark as Homecoming was, but it is still pretty dark for a game. Much like Homecoming, I had Downpour's brightness on full blast and still couldn't see things sometimes. And this isn't helped by the way that items are highlighted. Most of the time in the Silent Hill series, items are highlighted by blinking a bright yellow, and also your character will look toward the direction of an item when it's something that they can pick up or interact with. The problem with Downpour is that neither of these things are true. Items glow a very muted, kind of dark color that can blend in and sometimes not even register that it is changing colors on the screen. On top of this, if Murphy enters a room and the camera angle happens to change to a fixed camera, Murphy will not look at an item that is around him at all. You kind of just have to press A and guess. This makes the game really, really frustrating, especially when there's a point when you have to find an item to progress, or when you're trying to find, say, a map. And trust me, there are a few times when you are required to find an item in order to progress the game, and it's black against black, and it maybe is glowing a very, very faint, transparent yellow that you might see if you're looking really, really hard. It is common to get stuck in Downpour because the game isn't always super clear on what it wants you to grab or what it wants you to do. Puzzles in Downpour are fine. I don't really have anything notable to say about them. The game does have some really incredible scenes that it wants you to go through that feel really fun and nice, although sometimes some of the scenes can kill you, which doesn't feel fun and nice. Chase scenes, while done better in this game, still feel frustrating at times, sometimes to a point where I don't even want to play the game anymore for days at a time. And this game has the problem of having an invisible enemy type that will just hunt you down and attack you. For the most part, invisible enemies aren't that big of a deal, but, you know, they're still invisible enemies. Oh, I did almost forget that at the beginning of the game, it's made clear to you that there is a mechanic where police cars are roaming around, and if they see you, because you're a prisoner, their sirens will go off and the screen will turn white. When the screen comes back, you will be surrounded by enemies, and the enemies in this game can scream at you to stop you or incapacitate you for a second. Thankfully, you can stop the police cars by completing a side quest really, really, really early on in the game, but the first time I ever played this game, I never finished that side quest, and this became a really annoying part of the gameplay. It has its ups and downs, but ultimately I enjoyed Downpour a bit more than I really expected to. I honestly expected to hate this game, to think that it was the worst game in the series, and it ended up being better than a few of the other games in the series. I do also have to give props to the fact that Korn made the main theme for this song, and when I was 15 when the game came out, it was a song I listened to on repeat. Silent Hill music is so good. I haven't talked about it in either of these videos, but I've been using it as the background music for most of the segments. Silent Hill music is amazing. Back to Downpour, I think if you're a fan of Silent Hill, it is a game that you should play. It is fun, and while there are parts of it that are stale or frustrating, it is a pretty good game, and I think it's a good one to play. Mediocre Gaming gives Silent Hill Downpour a 6 out of 10. And there we have it, the entire Silent Hill series. I love Silent Hill. I have loved Silent Hill since I was a kid, and I was first introduced to Silent Hill 3, which was my first Silent Hill game. The series hits very near and dear to my heart, and for a long time it was my favorite game series of all time. When I was planning this video out, there was some debate if I should talk about Silent Hills, or more accurately PT, the playable teaser for Silent Hills, but I decided that since it wasn't a fully realized game and it wasn't fully indicative of the Silent Hills game that was going to come out, I just decided against it. Silent Hills being cancelled was sad. Moving on from that. If I had to rank Silent Hill as a series in total, I would give it a 7 out of 10. It is a great series, and I recommend anyone that enjoys horror to at least check out some of the games. That is all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below how you feel about my feelings on these games and how you feel about these games yourself. And until next time, drink your water.